Zelators, thank you for your love and support. I appreciate you all. On March 25th, 2026, the International Day of Remembrance for Victims of Slavery, the world gathered at the United Nations to do something that should have been done 400 years ago. A resolution was put forward to finally declare the trafficking of enslaved Africans as the gravest crime against humanity. Simply, right, moral, right, wrong. The United States, Israel, and Argentina voted no, and 52 other countries, including the United Kingdom and the entire European Union, abstained. 55 countries in total refused to stand with Africa. In 2026, they are still telling us that our ancestors' pain wasn't a crime because, at that time, their own laws said it was legal. Today we go deep into the great denial. We are talking about why these leaders still expect us to bow to them, why they claim to be our protectors, and why they are terrified of the one word they won't say: reparations. This resolution was spearheaded by Ghana. President John Mahama stood before the world and said, "There can be no peace without reparatory justice." The resolution was adopted with 123 votes in favor. But look at who stood against it. The same people we bow down to, the same people who love us so much, the same people who are here to protect us. The United States argues that declaring it a gravest crime creates hierarchy of atrocities. The US and the UK claim that because slavery was legal under international law at that time, they have no legal obligation to pay reparation today.
It is interesting to know that between 1619 and 1714, there were 16 parliamentary sessions in the British Parliament debating whether to have a joint stock company or open trade in enslaved Africans. Now, beyond that, there were also agreements between nations to determine who should supply enslaved Africans to their colonies in the Americas. So again, for instance, in 1713, there was an agreement between Spain and Britain, what we call the Asiento, granting it a monopoly on enslaved Africans for its colonies. And under it, they were supposed to supply 4,800 enslaved Africans per year for 30 years. Good morning, everyone.
Oh, let me give you your bio. It is Professor Idem Adoche, who is Associate Professor of African History at the Institute of African Studies, University of Ghana. He's a Pan-Africanist scholar with special interests in the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans and European colonialism in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Thank you, His Excellency. All protocols observed. I would like to start off from where His Excellency the President left us, which is the issue of terminology. And I think this is very important because it helps to put in proper historical context the issues we are discussing today. In most of the history textbooks that we read, we see the subject matter described as the transatlantic slave trade. But this obscures a couple of issues, and I'm just going to deal with three of them. One is the fact that when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade in quotes, we are talking about two related but separate issues here. One is the slave trade, and two is slavery. These are related but separate, and it's important that we make that distinction. And again, it's important we raise that because when it comes to the history of the transatlantic slave trade, the slave trade was abolished earlier, and it took several decades for the slave-owning nations to abolish the institution, which clearly tells us that these are two separate issues that we are dealing with. So, for example, Britain, for instance, abolished the trade in 1807, but abolished the institution in 1834. And even then said that enslaved Africans had to be apprenticed for 4 years before they acquired their freedom. Similarly, Denmark, which was one of the very first nations to abolish the trade, did that in 1803. But it took a slave rebellion in their Danish plantations in 1848 for the institution to be abolished. So we are talking about two issues here, and we need to pay attention to that. The second point that I want to make has to do with classifying the subject matter as a trade, because it gives the impression that we are just dealing with a normal economic routine of buying and selling of goods or products. But that is not necessarily the case. We are talking here about the forcible seizure of people whose productive and reproductive labor was exploited without compensation for centuries. So it's important that when we're talking about trade here, we understand that this is just not a normal trade that we're talking about. And I'm happy that on the brochure, we're talking about trafficking of enslaved peoples. This is not a trade that we are talking about. It is important we address that. And the third point that I want to highlight has to do with the issue about African slaves. And again, that is also very important because some apologies for the transatlantic slave trade, again in quotes, make the argument that many people in Africa were already slaves when they came here. So what they did was just to feed into an existing trade or institution and just took off people who were already slaves. So what they did to them was actually rather benefiting them because there was nothing special about what was happening. But in as much as the institution of slavery existed, and there's going to be another discussion of the nature of what existed here, these people were taken were not necessarily slaves. Many of them were free people who were captured, forcibly seized, and shipped across the Atlantic. So we are not talking about African slaves here, we are talking about enslaved Africans, and I'm happy that is also captured in the title. And to re-emphasize the point that these were not African slaves, but people who were enslaved, as our President rightly pointed out. We see that these people rebelled right from the very onset, from 1441 when the first group of Africans were taken away, right through the 15th century. We find King Afonso in the Congo writing to the King of Portugal protesting why free people were being taken away. We have instances of the rebellions in the Americas, the Maroon Age. We talk about even the slave wars in Golu, in the Upper East region of Ghana. All these instances show that these people were not goods, neither were they trade items, but these people were humans who were free, who wanted their independence. And right from the onset, they resisted their enslavement, and it's important that we put this in proper.
Très bon choix, ce complexe en bord de mer. Toute la famille profite à sa façon.
Context. So that is the first that I want to discuss. The second also has to do with the origins. Again, it's also about some historical inaccuracies in the records that we use. Now, many of us are told that the Europeans came to Africa and were traded in gold till about the latter part of the 15th century, when the Americas was discovered in quotes, and the need for labor because the indigenous people could not produce the kind of labor that existed. This is historically inaccurate. Right from the onset, when the Portuguese came in the 15th century, they were kidnapping and shipping Africans across to Europe. So the enslavement, the kidnapping and enslavement of Africans started way before plantation slavery in the Americas. And the other important point I also want to make is that this issue of enslavement of Africans also occurred in Africa before it was transported across the Atlantic. The Portuguese and the Spanish had plantations on the coast of Africa. We talk about Sao Tome, Canary Islands, we can talk about Cape Verde. All these places were plantations that the Portuguese and the Spanish employed or used enslaved African labor to produce sugar and other products in these spaces. So when we talk about the Europeans being around for a while and being trading in just what we later call legitimate goods, gold and other products regarding the shipment of Africans across the Atlantic. It is interesting to know that between 1619 and 1714, there were 16 parliamentary sessions in the British Parliament debating whether to have a joint stock company or open trade in enslaved Africans. Now, beyond that, there were also agreements between nations to determine who should supply enslaved Africans to their colonies in the Americas. So again, for instance, in 1713, there was an agreement between Spain and Britain, what we call the Asiento, granting it a monopoly on enslaved Africans for its colonies. And under it, they were supposed to supply 4,800 enslaved Africans per year for 30 years. So we see the kind of relationships that existed that enabled these enslavement of Africans. The third also has to do with laws on the treatment and use of these enslaved Africans, who were primarily treated as chattel, as property. And many of you will know of the slave ship Zonk, which in 1781 let's say that the captain threw overboard over 100 Africans on the ship and actually went on to claim insurance for the number of people that had been thrown on the slave ship, which clearly told you that there were laws that enabled some of these things to take place. Of course, later on, it was thrown away, but in the first instance, he won. Now, beyond that, we also have black codes or the slave codes that were all over the spaces that regulated the kind of relationships that existed between enslaved peoples and their masters. Many of them reinforced the idea that these people were property. So it's not surprising that many of the rules that we find in this period have several enslaved people as part of the property that are bequeathed to their heirs. So you find a spoon, a table, a land, cattle, and you find in there a Kwame or a John or a Ben or something else. And this clearly tells you how these people were treated primarily as chattel. Now, these are some of the key issues I want to raise for now, but the most important point I would like to conclude with is the fact that when we talk about this trade, again trade in quotes, in enslaved Africans, we are just not talking about a normal trade. We are talking about humans, and I think that is always forgotten in the conversation, that we are talking about humans whose consent was neither sought in these exchanges, whose labor, reproductive and sexual, was exploited without compensation for centuries. And it's important that we put at the center of this conversation the human beings that we are talking about. And what makes this trade, again in quotes, unique was the fact that it was racially based, it was permanent, it was hereditary enslavement of Africans, and the trafficking of Africans across the Atlantic and the enslavement also set the foundation for the racialized, exploitative global regime that persists today. Thank you very much.
Forward by adopting this landmark resolution declaring the trafficking of enslaved Africans and the racialized chattel enslavement of Africans as the gravest crime against humanity. With the adoption of this resolution, Resolution A/80/L48, we have not simply passed a text, we have affirmed a truth. We have chosen remembrance over silence, dignity over erasure, and shared humanity over division. We have advanced the cause of justice, and we have done that so emphatically. Those who voted in favor, 123 member states of the United Nations. 52 abstained, and only 3 voted against. This is an emphatic victory for justice. And our ancestors, Africans, and all people of African descent are today honored that our humanity and our dignity have been restored. Let me, on behalf of the African Group, express our profound appreciation to all member states who supported this resolution. We wish to thank those who engaged in its consideration in a spirit of dialogue, reflection, and good faith. We acknowledge that views differed during this process, and we note the positions taken by delegations that were not in a position to support the resolution at this time. The adoption of this text is not an arrival at a destination, but rather a major step in our ongoing journey and collective conversation for reparatory justice. We remain committed to continued engagement with all member states in the shared spirit of cooperation. Yesterday, His Excellency, the President of the Republic of Ghana, who initiated this landmark resolution, talked about the importance of language, how it shapes our understanding of the past and our vision for the future. Today, through this resolution, the world has spoken with clarity and truth. We have affirmed that the trafficking of enslaved Africans and their racialized chattel enslavement is the gravest crime against humanity, a crime whose scale, structure, and enduring consequences demand recognition at the highest level of our shared global conscience, so that we can move forward in healing and in preventing such a crime from ever happening again. This resolution is not about apportioning blame across generations or nations. It is not about reopening old wounds. It is about ensuring that those wounds are neither forgotten nor denied. It is about creating space for truth, for education, and for a more honest global conversation that allows us to move forward together with greater understanding. History, as we know, is rarely simple. It is layered, it is complex, and at times uncomfortable. This resolution does not deny that complexity. It does not ignore the many dimensions of historical experience. Rather, it recognizes that even within complexity, there are moments in history that stand apart, moments defined by their scale, their systemization, and their impact on humanity. To acknowledge this is not to diminish any other history. It is to deepen our collective moral awareness. What we have achieved today helps all of us in our renewed commitment to remembrance, so that future generations inherit truth, not silence, to education, so that history is taught with honesty and integrity, to dialogue, so that differences in perspective become opportunities for understanding, and to cooperation, so that we address the enduring legacies of history in ways that unite rather than divide. The resolution also opens the door for continued global engagement on reparatory justice, not as a narrow or transactional concept, but as a broader framework for healing, restoration, and partnership. It also calls for further actions within our respective states. We therefore urge every member state to consider carefully the actions it must take to ensure inclusive and good faith dialogue on reparatory justice. The work of justice does not end with remembrance. The racialized systems that adversely shaped our world must yield to a system that does not distinguish between our common humanity, and which seeks for the interests of all peoples in a fair, just, and equitable manner. Let me conclude with this reflection. We cannot change history, but we can change how we remember it. And in doing so, we can change what we carry forward. Today, the world has chosen to remember with purpose, justice, and equity. Let that purpose guide us toward a future that is more just, more inclusive, and more profoundly human. I would like to thank our negotiating team, staff of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the staff of our mission in New York, in Geneva, and in Addis Ababa. And I would like to thank especially our President, His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, for his vision, his dynamism, his effectiveness, which the UN Secretary General acknowledged today in their bilateral engagement, and for his humanity. His guidance has been absolutely phenomenal in bringing us to this historic moment. Ghana, Africa, and all people of African descent, and indeed all people of the world with good conscience, will eternally be grateful to President Mahama for his leadership at this defining hour in global history. I thank you very much for your indulgence, and I shall now take your questions.
Think about that. They are using the laws they wrote to justify the kidnapping of 13 million people. They are saying, we can't be held responsible because we made sure it was legal to hurt you. This is exactly what they are telling us today. We made it legal to hurt you. So why do you hold us accountable? Here is the part that bends. These are the same countries that fly into our capitals and talk to us about human rights. They send us security assistance. They give us development aid. We are told to believe they are the ones who give us protection. They are the ones that are giving us security. They love us so much and they don't want to see us suffer. We are told they are there to help us. But when it comes to acknowledging the very foundation of our poverty, the systematic looting of our people and resources, they shut the door. They shut the door. Why do we still bow? Why do our leaders worship the same people who don't see anything wrong with what was done to us? We bring them into our accounts. We flood our markets with their goods, with their products, with their everything. And we believe their narrative that they are our saviors. Yet, they won't even sign an abandoned paper acknowledging our humanity. This is what mental slavery looks like. They have convinced us that we need them more than they need us. And this is what we believe to date. They use the wealth built on our ancestors' backs to offer us loans with high interest. And African leaders are running for these things. They claim to protect us from terrorists, but as Burkina Faso recently said at the UN, many of these terrorists are fueled by their very instability created by foreign intervention. They cause the pain, they sell the bandage, and then they expect us to thank them for it. Why are these people not ready to admit that slavery is the gravest crime? Why are they running away from the money? Let's follow the money. Why did they abstain? Why did they vote no? Because once you admit it was the gravest crime against humanity, you are legally on the hook for reparations. Independent experts estimate the debt owed to Africa and the diaspora is between 100 billion US dollars and 130 trillion, 1.4. That is why they talk about remembrance but refuse justice. They are fine with a museum. They are not fine with a check. They want us to move on. But how do you move on from a crime that is still structuring the lives of all the people through racialized regimes of labor and capital? Africa has awoken. The vote in March 2026 proved that the global south is no longer waiting for permission to speak the truth. To our leaders, stop bowing to those who refuse to see your history as a crime. To the people, stop believing the savior narrative that these are the people that are here to help you and I. And moving there is the only way we can set ourselves free. The same people who cause the pain cannot be the ones to give us the cure. The security and the true help will only come when we stop worshipping those who haven't even apologized to us. What do you think about the 55 countries that refuse to stand with Africa? Is it time for Africa to walk away from this alliance? If you believe in justice, hit the subscribe button. United we stand, divided we fall, and united we keep standing forever and ever. The greatest enemy of the African is mental slavery. So let's decolonize ourselves from mental slavery. Let's keep sharing to educate our brothers and sisters. Together we'll make Africa great for ourselves and the next generations that are going to come. So that's the latest around the world. in the West,